So now we are going to cover function. So what is function basically? So a programming task may be split into multiple simple tasks. When your project is very large, so you would not prefer to write everything in one inside main function. So what you can do basically, you can split into multiple tasks, and then each task you can implement using function, right? So function, you can think of like a small task that you want to implement in your project. You can implement it through a function. So function has different name in different programming languages. In some language you will hear them as module, some language you will hear them as procedure. In C++ or C, we refer them to as function, right? So you already have seen a function which is known as main function. You already have seen that. So here we'll learn how we can define our other function other than main and how we can use them, right? So as we know that all C or C++ uh, programs, they must contain a main function, and then they may contain additional functions, right? So those functions, we call them as user-defined functions, right? Now, how does a function interact with other functions, including main? So here we learn how to correctly pass data to those functions and how these functions will return correctly the values to the caller, right? So a function is called by another function. So the function that is calling it is called caller, and the function which is being called is called callee, right? So how do we call a function? So you have used that, but again, we are revisiting that. So here, when you want to call a function, so what you have to do, basically, you have to provide the name of the function, right? And inside parentheses, you pass arguments, right? So if you have a function may take basically 0 arguments, you pass a function without passing in, you call a function without passing a data, that is possible. You may call a function by passing only one data, that's also possible. And you may have function which you may call with more than one data items, okay? So how do we call a function? So we have to write the name of the function, and inside parentheses, we pass basically data, and then we have to turn it, we have to close it with basically semicolon, right? So example of function calling is you have already used square root function, sqrt function from CMath library, right? So here in sqrt function that you are calling, you pass 16, and the function will return you square root of 16, which is 4, right? And we do not know how square root of the function is implemented, but here what we are doing, basically, we are calling the function by using its name, and then we are passing the data, and then after that, we are putting a semicolon, right? So here, another function example that you see here, which is used for sorting, which is known as quick sort. So in this function, what we are passing, basically the name of the function is qsort, and then here we are passing an array, which you don't need to worry about that. So this is one data item, then this is another data item, this is another data item, and then this is another data item, right? So here you see that this qsort function, it takes 4 items, and the sqrt function, it takes only 1 item, right? And there might be cases where a function may take basically 0 items also, right? So to call a function, in summary, you have to use the name of the function, and inside parentheses, you basically pass the data to that function, and then you close the statement by semicolon, right? So that's how we basically call a function, and you have already done that, basically, right? So now in this lecture, our focus is not to call the existing function. Rather, we want that how we can define our own functions, basically, right? So here, how do we define our own function? Let's look at it. So to define our own function, so this is basically the syntax to define our own function, right? So here, how do we define function? So first, we provide the type of data that the function will return, right? So for example, you have seen that sqrt function. So in sqrt function, it returns basically a double number, because if you pass, let's say in sqrt function, if you pass 16, so it will return you 4. But let's say if you pass uh, 20, right? So square root of 20 is not an integer, so it will be a decimal point number. So the return data type for sqrt function is double, right? So here, similarly, if you want to define any function, you should know that what is the type of data that your function will return when it will finish its task, right? So that data type you have to provide, right? Then you have to pick a function name. So this function name, you have to follow the name of the identifier, rule of the identifiers to get the function name. So the function name should not be basically uh, a keyword, or the function name should be basically unique in your project. There should not be any function which has the same name as your function is. So you have to follow the rule of the function naming. And then after that, you have to put a parenthesis, and inside parenthesis, you will put basically the data that will be passed to this function, right? So here, if you have more than one data item, so each data item will be comma separated, right? So when you provide the data item, what you have to provide the type of data item and a name you have to provide, right? And then inside a pair of curly braces, you will put basically the statements, right? So you may have variable declaration or constant declaration statements, just like in main function. Then you may have arithmetic and logical statements, just like in main you have, and then you may have display statements as well, right? So, and then at the end, if your function is returning some kind of like integer, double, float, char, or string, so then at the end, you will return a value. So you will use the keyword return, and then after that, you will use a value, right? So this value, the type of this value should match with the return data type, okay? So this function definition that you are seeing here inside the pair of curly braces, you have already seen that when you wrote main function, right? So in main function, basically, you define your own, basically. So you write what you want to do with the main function, right? So you have defined already main function. So here you will define a function other than main function, right? So you will basically define a couple of functions, which is not main function, right? So, but the rules are same. Whatever you have done to write a main function, you will follow the same rule. You will declare variables or constant. You will write arithmetic and logical statements. You may write display statements. And then if the function returns some kind of numbers or string or characters, then you will have return value, right? So that's the way that we define a function, right? Okay, so now let's see an example of function definition, right? So here, let's look at this. So this is the format that we have to follow to define our own function, right? So here, let's see that there is an example here, which is called find max. Okay, so let's say we have to write a function which will take two numbers, and then this function will return the largest number, okay, among the two, basically. So how do we write that, right? So here, let's pick the function name is basically find max, right? And this function, let's say it takes two integers and compare them and returns the largest one. So the return type of this function will be int, right? So return type will be int, because this function is going to take two integers and then it will compare and then it will return to you, right? So the return type is basically integer, right? So here first we have to provide the return type, which is int in this case. Then this is the function name, find max. And then this function takes two items, right? So it takes two items and both of them are basically integers. And how do I know that two items? Because they are separated by one comma. So the item, there's one item to the left of the comma and the another item which is on the right on the comma, right? Right after the comma. So here one item, first item is of integer type and the name of that item is m. And the second item is also of type integer and the name of the item is n, right? Okay. And then here inside basically the function body, we have this code, right? And this code is exactly looking like what you have seen in main function. Here we have declared a variable temp, which is of type integer. And then here we are comparing m and n for greater than or equal to relationship. So if m is greater than or equal to n, so we will assign m to temp variable, else we'll assign n to temp variable, right? And then we return basically this temp to the caller, right? So this we write return temp. So now here you see that we are using m and n, and we did not have declare them, right? So here the data that you are passing to a function, right? So here m and n, they're passed to the function, so they are recognized inside this function. Okay, so m and n, you don't need to declare them. They are passed data from to the function find max. So they will be recognized inside the body of this function find max, right? So the data that you are passing into a function that need not to be declared, that should not be declared inside the basically function body, that those data will be recognized by itself inside the function of the body, right? Okay, so this is called our own user defined function. So this is how we define our own function, right? Now, how do we use our own user defined function? Let's take an example of this. So how do we use it? Basically, how do we call our user defined function, right? So let's say here we have basically an example where we are calling our own user defined function, right? So here, this is basically, we have include IO stream using namespace std, right? And then we have this thing basically, right? So here int find max int comma int parenthesis close and semicolon. That the thing that you are seeing here, it's called function prototype. It is called function signature because it doesn't have the body of find max, right? So when do we use it? So when we define our function in separate file, or we define it after main. So in this case, you are seeing that this find max is defined after main function. And but this find max, if you see, it is called inside the main function, right? So if a function is defined in a separate file, or if it is defined in a after the main function, but it is called inside the main function, so then you need to put basically this prototype. Okay, so this prototype, if you see that, it is exactly similar to the first line of the function from here to here, and then after that you put a semicolon, right? So here you see that the first line of the function, so we have return type, we have the name of the function, and then here we have basically in parentheses we have basically type of the data that will be passed to it, right? So here we have just put the type of data that is passed. We have not put the name for that data, right? So here int, if we have int m, so we don't need to write m, basically we just wrote int, and then here we wrote int basically, right? So here this is called prototype, right? So when do we use prototype? When the function is defined after main, or if it is defined in a separate file, right? Okay. So in this case, we have defined find max function after main function, right? So we have main function here, and then we have defined this find max function after it, right? Now, how do we call it? So let's say here, if you look at this, so in main function, we have a variable tmp, right? And then here we are displaying find maximum, and then we are calling this find max function, right? So find max function, if you see the definition of find max function, it takes basically two data items, right? The first one is this, and the second one is this, right? So it takes two data items. So that's why we have passed 5 and 7. These are two data items. So 5 will be assigned to m, and 7 will be assigned to n, right? So they will be assigned, right? And then when basically they will go as m and n, then the comparison will be made between them. And based on that, this temp will be basically get a value based on if m is greater than n, temp will be m. If else, temp will be n. So in this case, temp will be 7, right? And then we are returning this 7, right? So through tmp, we are returning this through this tmp. So whatever is returned by this find max function, right? So that is going to assign to this variable, right? So here, one thing you should know that, so this temp that you are seeing here in main function and this temp that you are seeing in find max function, they are different. In this case, they will get the same value based on the function logic, but they have different existences, right? Keep that in mind, right? So here you have basically three things. One is that you define a function that is called user defined function. In this case, find max is a user defined function, which is taking two integer numbers, right, as data, int m and int n, and then it basically returns the maximum as tmp, which is an integer type. So that's the integer type, right? So this entire thing is called the function definition. And then if the function is defined after main, so in this case, the function is defined after main function. So we have put a prototype, function prototype here, right? Which is exactly looking like the first line of the function definition without the body. And then we call this function inside main function here, right? Okay, so that's how a function is called, a user-defined function is called. You need to define it, then you will be able to call it, right? So sqrt or other function, power function that you have seen, they have been defined basically already in the language, and you use them through their prototype in C math library, right? Right. So now let's see basically function prototype, right? So let's talk about function prototype. So function prototype, you can think of signature of a function, right? So for example, we have used sqrt function for square root, right? So how the prototype of that function looks like, right? So this function sqrt, the name of the function is sqrt, and then it takes only one item, and the type of that item is double, and then it returns you a double value, right? For example, if you pass 25, so it will return basically 5. If you pass basically 20, it will return you something like 4 point something. So here, the return type is basically double, and the function name is sqrt, and then it takes basically double item, right, as data, right? So now that's called, and then you have a semicolon. So each prototype should be ended by a semicolon, right? So now here there's a problem that you can work on. So here is it's the problem says that define prototypes for a function to convert miles to kilometers, right? So here, if I have to define the if I have to write the prototype for this function, right? Not define, right? So how do I do that? So let's say I will pick a name, uh, function name. I will say miles to kilos. Okay, let's say this name I pick, and then this will take basically miles as data because it will convert that mile to kilometer. So I would say the miles that it will take, let's say it's a double type. It may take basically, let's say 5.6 mile, 10 mile, 100.5 miles, something like that. And then the value that it will return, it will also be of decimal point type because 1 mile is equal to 1.6 something kilometers, right? So it will also return double actually, right? Okay. So that's basically the function prototype, right? And then the second one, take two numbers. The function defines prototype for function that takes two numbers and returns greatest common divisor, right? So here, the two numbers that you will pass, they will be of integer type, and the greatest common divisor for them will be also integer type, right? So how do I do that? So let's say I pick the function name as GCD, greatest common divisor, and then it will take two basically number as parameters. So type of these number will be, let's say integer. So I will basically, so it will take two numbers. So the first number will be integer type, and the second number will be integer type. And then greatest common divisor of two integers will be also an integer. So return will be also integer type, because when this function will return you the greatest common divisor, it will be of return integer type, right? So that's the prototype for the second function. Okay. So here, basically, this is some example, right? So here it is saying that, okay, you can define basically a function, right? That can basically take, let's say, hours, minutes, and seconds as input, and then it will give you basically total seconds in those hours, minutes, and seconds, right? So how do we define the function, right? So let's work on this example. Okay? So let's work on this.